Imagine that moment, when healthcare is really stretched thin.
Yeah.
A big accident maybe, or someone critical in the ICU.
Yeah.
Being able to stabilize someone fast when their blood pressure just tanks.
Yeah.
Well, it can literally be life or death.
Absolutely. And right there in those critical moments, well, the key things clinicians reach for is norepinephrine bitartrate.
Right?
It's essential for treating that acute hypotension, those sudden, really dangerous drops in blood pressure.
Yeah.
It's a cornerstone of emergency and critical care.
Exactly. And today, we're not just looking at the final drug, are we? We're diving into the market for the reagent form, Norepinephrine Bitartrate Reagent.
Mm-hmm.
Why the reagent? Well, sources like this cognitive market research data we're looking at often break it down this way.
Yeah, you do.
Because that reagent is vital for things like quality control, for research, and it's the high purity starting point in manufacturing. So it gives you this upstream view of the supply chain.
Precisely. It's like looking under the hood, as you said. And this data set gives us that view. So our mission really in this deep dive is to unpack these numbers from cognitive market research and see what they tell us about where this crucial reagent market is heading globally and, region by region.
Okay, so let's explore this data together, you and us. Starting globally, the source says the market for this reagent was worth $674.9 million back in 2021.
Right. And the data shows a pretty clear growth path from there. It's projected to hit $842.4 million by 2025. Just a couple years away.
Okay, a solid jump. And what about the longer view? This source looks out to 2033.
It does. By 2033, they expect the market to nearly double its 2021 size. The projection is $812.6 million.
Wow. Okay, that's some serious expansion over the next decade or so.
Yeah.
What's the overall growth rate, the CAGR?
The source calculates that global compound annual growth rate, the CAGR, at a steady 5.7%.
5.7%. Okay. And according to the data, what's behind that steady growth? What's pushing this market forward?
Well, the sources point to a few key things. A big one is just, rising demand worldwide for emergency heart drugs, like the ones using norepinephrine bitartrate.
Makes sense.
But beyond that, there are broader trends. Things like advancements in emergency care itself, getting better capabilities.
Right.
More hospitals being built or expanded in lots of places. And, this is crucial, more money going into pharmaceutical R&D.
Yeah.
Investment is growing.
Yeah, that all tracks. Better emergency medicine, more facilities, more research. It naturally drives up the need for these fundamental high purity ingredients.
Yeah.
Like this reagent.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the big picture. Let's zoom in a bit. How does this look regionally? Let's start with North America based on the sources breakdown.
Right. North America, the data shows it as the largest regional market right now. It was a pretty substantial $271.3 million back in 2021.
Okay.
Projected to grow to $334 million by 2025, and then expected to reach $510.6 million by 2033.
So definitely the biggest slice of the pie currently. What of the growth rate in North America?
The CAGR for North America is pegged at 5.4%. The source calls this, strong and stable growth, a big contributor globally, even if it's just a touch below that global average of 5.7%.
Okay, 5.4%. Stable. And within North America, the U.S. is obviously the giant.
It is, yeah. The U.S. market by itself was $190.2 million in 2021. It's heading towards $230.6 million by 2025, and the forecast for 2033 is $343.4 million.
And its growth rate?
Its CAGR is 5.1%, so a little bit slower than the North American average, actually.
Interesting. Is anywhere in North America growing faster then, according to this data?
Yes, Canada actually stands out here. Smaller market size, starting at $55.1 million in 2021.
Okay.
But it's projected to grow quicker, reaching $72.9 million in 2025, and then a pretty notable $120 million by 2033. Its CAGR is higher at 6.4%.
6.4% for Canada.
And Mexico is growing steadily, too. $26 million in 2021, expected to reach $47.2 million by 2033. That's a 5.6% CAGR.
So Canada's outpacing the U.S. in terms of growth rate for this specific region.
Interesting. All right, from North America, let's cross the Atlantic to Europe. Okay, Europe. The source presents it as the second largest market. Revenue was $169.4 million in 2021.
Right.
Projected to climb to $207.6 million by 2025, and then $318.4 million by 2033.
Still a very significant market. And its overall growth pace, similar to North America.
Very similar. Europe's regional CAGR is 5.5%, according to the source. Again, described as strong, stable growth, right in line with North America's rate.
Now, Europe's obviously very diverse. Does the data break down growth within Europe, Where are the hot spots, or maybe the slower spots?
Yeah, definitely variations. The UK actually mirrors Canada's faster pace. It shows a 6.4% CAGR,
Oh,
growing from $25.7 million in 2021 up to $53.8 million by 2033. Germany, a major economy, shows solid growth too, 5.8% CAGR. That's $34.6 million up to $67.8 million. France is a bit slower, 4.8% CAGR, moving from $31 million to $54.6 million.
okay, so a bit of a range there. Any country's growing notably slower than that 5.5% average?
Yes, the source does point out Italy. Its CGR is 4.6%, growing from $21.2 million to $35.3 million by 2033. Russia is also shown with a lower CAGR, 4.4%. That's $17.3 million up to $29.2 million. Spain is closer to the average at 5.1%, going from $14.2 million to $24.6 million. And Luxembourg, smaller base, but 5.6%.
So quite a mix, but was there any part of Europe that really stood out for high growth in this report?
Yes, and this is really interesting. There's a category the source labels Rest of Europe.
Okay. Not one country.
No, it's collective.
Yeah.
But together, this group shows rapid acceleration. It jumps from just $11.9 million in 2021 to a pretty significant $28.6 million by 2033.
Wow.
And that comes out to a substantial 7.5% CAGR. The source highlights this specifically. Highest growth rate within Europe, and actually one of the highest mentioned anywhere in the whole data set.
7.5% for rest of Europe. Okay, that's definitely a hotspot to note. Right, let's pivot now. Asia Pacific, often cited as a high-growth region in general.
And this data absolutely confirms that for this market, Asia Pacific's overall CAGR is 6.7%.
Higher than North America and Europe?
Yep. The source explicitly calls it out as the fastest growing major region in the study. The market value there was $137 million in 2021, growing to $179 million by 2025, and expected to really expand, hitting $300.5 million by 2033.
Okay, significantly faster expansion.
Yeah.
So who's driving that rapid pace within Asia Pacific, according to the numbers?
Well, China is the largest market there by size. It's growing from $41.4 million in 2021 up to $92.2 million by 2033. That's a strong 6.9% CAGR.
Nearly 7%.
Okay. Japan is also major, obviously, expanding from $34.4 million to $70.8 million over that same period. That's a solid 6% CAGR.
And what about India? You always hear about growth or Indian pharma and healthcare?
India is shown as a major engine here, really stands out. Starts at $27.8 million in 2021, projected to reach $38.1 million by 2025, and then hits $68.1 million by 2033.
Really growth rate.
It's got a CAGR of 7.5%. High growth. Matches that rest of Europe figure we saw.
Wow.
The source notes it as one of the highest global growth rates mentioned anywhere in the report.
So India is a really key driver then.
Yeah.
What other areas in Asia Pacific show strong growth?
South Korea looks strong, 6.4% CAGR, growing from $14.2 million to $30.1 million by 20.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Growing from $14.2 million to $30.1 million by 2033.
Mm-hmm.
Australia is similar, 6.5% CAGR. Smaller numbers, $7.1 million to $15.1 million. And then there's Southeast Asia, which the source groups together, dynamic area. It shows a healthy 7% CAGR, expanding from $7 million to $16.2 million by 2033.
Okay, so Asia Pacific is definitely where the heat is,
Yeah.
growth-wise. India and Southeast Asia really pushing that based on this data. Let's shift again, South America.
South America. The picture here is more, let's say, moderate growth compared to Asia Pacific. Still positive, though.
Right.
The source breaks it down by country. Brazil is the largest market. It grows from $23.5 million in 2021 to $44 million by 2033. That's a 5.4% CAGR.
Okay.
Argentina's right behind it. Very similar pace. 5.3% CAGR, going from $15.6 million to $28.7 million. And Colombia's right there, too. 5.4% CAGR.
So pretty stable growth across the bigger economies there. Any country showing a notably slower pace in South America?
Yes. Peru's growth is noted as slower, 4.5% CAGR, moving from $6.3 million to $10.7 million by 2033.
Okay.
And Chile is a bit higher, but still lagging the others, 4.9% CAGR, growing from $3.2 million to $5.6 million. So yeah, some slower pockets within the region.
Got it. Okay, finally, let's look at the Middle East and Africa region. What does the data show there?
The data for MEA highlights a couple of key countries mainly. Egypt's market is shown expanding from $8.8 million in 2021 to $17.2 million by 2033. That's a 5.3% CGR.
Okay.
Turkey grows from $5.3 million to $10.5 million over the same time frame. That's a 5.2% CGR. So similar pace to Egypt.
And anything particularly stand out about growth in the rest of that region? Anything notable?
Yes, actually. The source specifically flags the category rest of the Middle East for showing, well, remarkably limited growth.
Really? How limited?
It's projected to move from $2.6 million in 2021 to just $4.2 million by 2033. The KGR calculated is only 2.2%.
Wow. 2.2%. That's low.
It is. The source presents it as the lowest growth rate found across all the regions and countries they detailed, a real contrast to some of those high-flying numbers elsewhere.
Yeah, quite the difference. Okay, we've walked through a lot of numbers there. Regions, countries, KGRs. Let's try and pull this all together. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the norepinephrine bitartrate reagent market data?
Well, the big picture from this source is definitely one of consistent global growth for this critical region, nearly doubling in value over the next decade or so.
Right, driven by those core needs.
Exactly. Fundamentally tied to the growing need for emergency heart treatments and those underlying factors. Better emergency care, more hospital infrastructure, and that R&D investment.
But what really jumps out from the regional data is just how uneven that growth is projected to be.
Absolutely. Asia-Pacific is clearly positioned as the growth engine for the future here, especially with India and Southeast Asia leading the charge. And you also see that acceleration in places like, remember, the rest of Europe, Canada, the UK as well.
Right. And then you have North America and most of Europe. Larger markets now, but growing more steadily, more moderately, maybe reflecting more mature healthcare systems.
That seems to be the implication in the data, yes. Stable growth there. And then, of course, you have the areas projecting notably slower growth, like Italy, Russia, parts of South America, we mentioned Peru, Chile.
And particularly that rest of the Middle East category with that very low 2.2% CAGR.
Exactly.
It's really fascinating, isn't it, how the growth rates for just this one essential medical compound might, according to this data, reflect those bigger trends, where are advancements in emergency care happening fastest? Where is hospital building booming? Where's the R&D money flowing most strongly?
Yeah, looking purely at these market numbers based on this source gives you a very specific kind of economic lens on those global healthcare dynamics.
So what does this mean for you listening? We've taken this market research data, broken it down from global to local, looking at the norepinephrine bitartrate reagent market. We've seen this picture emerge. A market expanding steadily overall, driven by absolutely critical medical needs, but with really significant differences in how fast different parts of the world are expected to grow between now and 2033.
We've really just tried to unpack the numbers here from the source to show you the dynamics of a market that's, well, pretty crucial for emergency medicine.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought, something to chew on, based only on what we've seen in this specific data set.
Okay.
What might these dramatically different growth projections for this vital emergency medical component, from that super fast growth in India or rest of Europe down to the much slower pace in rest of the Middle East or Italy, what might that imply about the global landscape of, say, emergency medical care access or maybe healthcare investment priorities looking out towards 2033?
That's a really interesting question to ponder, reflecting on those regional disparities the market data seems to highlight.
Yeah, something for you to think about based on what we've explored together in this deep dive into the sources. Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us some really interesting source material here. It's focused on something that, well, it might sound incredibly specific at first glance. Norepinephrine bitartrate reagents.
It really does sound highly technical, doesn't it? But, as your sources show, this one chemical component is surprisingly fundamental. It connects to a much bigger picture in healthcare and, well, innovation, too.
Exactly. So our mission today, sticking to the sources you've given us, is to really dig into what these reagents are. Why are they becoming so important? What are the kind of forces driving their market?
And the challenges, too, right? Plus the exciting trends shaping their future.
Right. Hopefully by the end, you'll see how this seemingly niche topic really ties together threads across medicine, technology, and maybe even global health strategy.
Yeah, it's quite interconnected.
So let's jump right in. When the sources talk about norepinephrine bitartrate reagents, what exactly are we referring to?
Well, norepinephrine bitartrate itself, that's a compound probably familiar if you're in critical care. It's very commonly used as a vasopressor, managing things like dangerously low blood pressure.
Got it. Okay. So that's the active drug people might receive. But the focus in your sources, it seems, is specifically on its reagent form. What's the difference there, and where is that being used?
That's really the key distinction here, the reagent form. This refers to versions made with extremely high purity. They're specifically for use in research, in testing, development work, not for direct clinical administration.
Oh, okay.
And your source material, it highlights several key areas where this super high purity form is absolutely essential.
Like where, for instance?
Well, the sources point to significant use in clinical diagnostics, so developing and validating tests that give doctors crucial info about a patient's health.
Right.
It's also vital in pharmaceutical R&D. I mean, that's the engine room, isn't it? Where new drugs get discovered, developed, tested.
Makes sense.
And naturally, it's a staple in academic labs too, investigations across biochemistry, pharmacology, all those related fields.
So this is more like the foundational material.
Yeah.
Used to build the future of medicine and understand disease, rather than just the final product you see in a hospital.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Given that role, what are the main forces driving the demand for these specific reagents according to the sources you shared?
What's fascinating and what the source material really emphasizes is that the demand isn't just one thing. It's being pushed by several powerful forces, and they're kind of interconnected.
Okay, let's explore those drivers then.
So one major driver the sources really highlight is simply expanding research. There's a documented increase in its use in both cardiovascular and neurological research fields.
Studying heart disease and brain disorders, you mean?
Precisely. And as scientists delve deeper, into the really complex mechanisms behind these conditions, trying to find new therapies or diagnostic tools, they absolutely require highly reliable, high-purity compounds, like these norepinephrine bitartrate reagents.
Because the quality of the tools affects the results.
Exactly. The quality of the research tools directly impacts the validity of the findings. You need that consistency.
Okay, so more in-depth research needs better, more specific ingredients, so to speak.
Got it.
What else did the sources point to as boosting demand?
Another pretty significant factor is advancements in pharmaceutical technologies themselves. The sources talk about how innovations are actually enhancing the therapeutic potential of norepinephrine.
How do they describe that? What kind of innovations?
They give examples like developing biocompatible carriers or cutting-edge drug delivery systems. Think about new ways to formulate the drug, or maybe get it precisely where it needs to go in the body. That could improve efficacy or, reduce side effects.
So it's not just about the molecule itself, but how it's packaged and delivered that's evolving.
Exactly. And as these delivery methods get more sophisticated and they're explored in R&D, there's this corresponding increase in demand for the quality-controlled reagents needed to do all that preclinical and clinical testing.
All right, the testing has to keep pace.
Yeah, the R&D process for these advanced systems relies heavily on these high-grade inputs.
That connection between the molecule and the delivery system is really interesting. What was the third key driver the sources identify?
This one, well, it might seem a little less obvious at first. It's the increasing integration of digital health solutions.
Digital tech, influencing demand for a chemical reagent. How does the source material explain that link? It sounds a bit indirect.
It is a subtle link, but an important one they draw out. The sources point to the rise of tools like, say, smart infusion pumps or electronic health records used in critical care settings where norepinephrine might actually be administered.
Okay. And these digital tools, they improve precision, I assume.
They do, significantly. They allow for incredibly precise monitoring, dosage calculation, administration. Now, according to the sources, this digital precision actually increases the reliance on the fundamental accuracy and dependability of the reagents used way back in the process, used to develop and test the drugs that get loaded into these systems. For a smart pump to deliver a tiny, accurate dose safely, based on real-time patient data, the drug formulation itself, which was validated through all that rigorous testing, it must be built upon absolutely reliable reagent standards from the get-go.
Wow. So the digital precision on the ward actually circles all the way back to demanding chemical purity in the lab.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Actually circles all the way back to demanding chemical purity in the lab. That really highlights how interconnected modern healthcare actually is.
Okay, so the demand picture looks strong, driven by research, new tech, even digital health, but, no market is without its hurdles. What challenges or restraints did the sources outline?
That's right, yeah. There are definite headwinds mentioned. One of the primary challenges is the issue of high cost combined with limited supply.
Why is it particularly costly to make?
Well, the production process itself, it requires extremely high purity raw materials. And getting to that level of purity, it demands advanced infrastructure, complex processing techniques. All of that drives up the manufacturing costs quite a bit.
And the supply side, you mentioned that too. Yeah, add to that the specific raw inputs you need for this level of purity. Well, they can have limited availability. According to the sources, this makes the supply chain particularly challenging to scale up efficiently. And that poses difficulties, especially for, say, small companies trying to enter or just compete in this market.
Okay, so the cost of achieving that purity and the scarcity of the basic ingredients are major brakes on growth. What's another significant restraint the sources mentioned?
Another major hurdle discussed in the sources involves the stringent regulatory requirements. Getting approvals for pharmaceutical-grade reagents from bodies like the FDA in the US or the EMA in Europe, it's definitely not a quick process.
Yeah, I can imagine that's time-consuming.
It really is. It's complex, rigorous, and often incredibly time-intensive. These regulatory requirements, they can significantly delay new products getting to market, and they add considerable costs to R&D budgets for the manufacturers.
Delays and increased costs sounds like, well, standard regulatory friction, but maybe amplified here because of the high purity nature of these materials.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. It seems amplified.
Okay. What was the final challenge the sources brought up?
The third restraint relates back to the compound's inherent properties and its clinical use. Specifically, the potential for side effects and contraindications associated with norepinephrine itself when used as a drug.
Right. What specific side effects did the sources list?
The material mentions potential adverse reactions, including things like elevated blood pressure, arrhythmias, which are irregular heartbeats, and anxiety.
And how do those clinical concerns actually impact the reagent market? That seems like another step removed.
Well, the sources suggest that while norepinephrine is essential, the potential for these side effects can sometimes lead doctors to be cautious. Maybe limit the widespread adoption of certain norepinephrine-based treatments, or perhaps favor alternatives if they exist. And this caution in clinical practice can, in turn, subtly influence the overall market demand for the reagents used in developing those associated drugs or therapies. Basically, if the downstream clinical application faces limitations, the upstream demand for the R&D inputs can feel that effect.
So the realities of using the actual drug in patients kind of echo back to the market for the materials used to study and develop it. It really is an ecosystem, isn't it?
Right.
Okay, so we've seen what these reagents are, what's pushing their demand, and what's kind of holding them back. Let's turn to the future now. What exciting trends did the sources identify for this norepinephrine bitartrate reagent market?
Yeah, looking ahead, the sources point to some pretty fascinating developments. One significant trend is the increasing development and adoption of biosimilar formulations.
Biosimilars, like generic versions, but for more complex biological drugs, right?
Exactly. It's a similar idea, creating highly similar, hopefully lower-cost alternatives. The sources indicate that as biosimilars for norepinephrine-related therapies gain regulatory approval and physicians get comfortable using them, it's leading to more market competition.
Which could mean reduced costs and wider access.
Potentially, yeah. Reduced treatment costs and broader patient access globally are the hopes.
And how does that affect the reagent market specifically?
Well, this more competitive environment, it pushes the reagent manufacturers. They need to innovate, maybe offer diversified product lines for different biosimilar needs, and they certainly need to scale production more efficiently to meet the demand from these biosimilar producers and, well, stay competitive themselves.
So biosimilars aren't just changing the drug market, but the underlying component market too. Interesting. What's another trend for the future the sources pointed to?
Another major trend is the growing role of personalized medicine. The sources specifically mention advances in pharmacogenomics.
Pharmacogenomics. That's tailoring treatments based on an individual's genetic makeup, right?
Exactly that. This allows for the potential tailoring of norepinephrine treatments based on, say, a patient's specific genetic data, predicting how they might respond or maybe how they metabolize the drug. And if you're moving towards such precise, individualized treatment...
That you need equally precise tools to develop and test those specific variations, I suppose.
Precisely. The sources strongly suggest this creates a need for customized, or at least highly specific, reagents. You need them to support the design and testing of these precision drugs and treatment protocols. It's definitely a trend that demands flexibility and specificity from the reagent suppliers.
Customized reagents for customized medicine that really feels like the cutting edge. Okay, what was the final trend the sources highlighted?
The third key trend mentioned is geographic expansion, specifically into emerging markets.
Which regions did they name?
The sources point to significant growth potential in places like the Asia-Pacific region, Latin America, and also Africa.
And why these areas specifically? What's driving growth there?
According to the material, many parts of these regions are seeing rapidly developing healthcare infrastructure, particularly in critical care facilities and advanced laboratories.
Okay.
And this development is creating a surge in demand for essential components like norepinephrine reagents in places like ICUs and clinical diagnostic labs. They're becoming increasingly standard tools there.
So manufacturers are looking to these new markets for growth and maybe to meet unmet needs as well.
Yes, exactly. They're seen as really vital areas for global market expansion, offering manufacturers opportunities to reach new patient populations and, drive overall market volume.
Okay, let's try and bring this deep dive to a close then. We started with something that sounded, well, incredibly technical, norepinephrine bitartrate reagents, and just guided by the sources you provided, we really explored its world.
Yeah, we've seen how these high-purity chemicals are truly indispensable tools in diagnostics, drug discovery, academic research.
And how their market demand is being, well, pretty robustly driven, isn't it? By expanding research, innovations in pharma delivery, and even, surprisingly, the integration of digital health tech.
Yeah, they definitely navigate real challenges, from the high costs and limited supply that come with high-purity manufacturing to the complexities of global regulation, and even the clinical considerations tied to the drug itself.
But the future, based on this source material anyway, it seems dynamic, full of opportunity, shaped by things like the rise of biosimilars, the promise of personalized medicine, and that significant geographic expansion into new markets.
What truly stands out, I think, from the sources is how the relevance and the demand for these specific reagents, they're not just holding steady. They seem to be actively growing, propelling the market forward, despite those hurdles we talked about.
So you've just taken a deep dive into what seemed like a maybe small piece of the healthcare puzzle, and hopefully discovered how fundamentally it connects to these much larger forces of innovation, technology, and global health expansion.
Yeah, and maybe here's something to think about, reflecting on the sources. How does the really complex journey of even a single essential component, like these norepinephrine bitartrate reagents, starting from that difficult high-purity manufacturing, then navigating those intricate regulatory pathways, proving its worth in clinical trials, and finally reaching global markets and enabling personalized patient care? How does that whole journey vividly illustrate the vast interconnected ecosystem that's required to bring any meaningful medical advance from, say, the lab bench to the patient today?
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.